Here we are at Walkerville, in the Walkerville Library with very special Pip Williams. What an honour to speak to you.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Karen.
So, can I start with the very beginning?
Yes.
Which is, could you say more about why you decided to begin the story with that of Esme and her father in the scriptorium, the arrival of the word Lily, and then the lunge into the fire, which led to Esme's burnt hand and her funny fingers for the rest of her life?
So The Dictionary of Lost Words is my first novel, and basically I have woven fiction, the fictional story of a girl called Esme, through the real story of the development of the Oxford English Dictionary. And yes, I start right at the beginning with Esme at around about the age of 4, and it was important for the story, I think, that Esme develops an interest in words that is particularly strong. So not just a curiosity for words, but words had to be tangible for Esme. They had to be incredibly important, and in some ways they had to be threatened. So for the story to evolve the way I wanted it to, they are some of the things that I had to set up right from the beginning. Would you like me to read the very start?
Let's hear those pages.
So this is actually the prologue, and it's in February 1886. Before the lost word, there was another. It arrived at the scriptorium in a second-hand envelope, the old address crossed out, and Dr. Murray, Sunnyside, Oxford, written in its place. It was Da's job to open the post, and mine to sit on his lap like a queen on her throne, and help him ease each word out of its folded cradle. He'd tell me what pile to put it on, and sometimes he'd pause, cover my hand with his, and guide my finger up and down and around the letters, sounding them into my ear. He'd say the word and I would echo it. Then he'd tell me what it meant. This word was written on a scrap of brown paper, its edges rough where it had been torn to match Dr. Murray's preferred dimensions. Da paused, and I readied myself to learn it. But his hand didn't cover mine, and when I turned to hurry him, the look on his face made me stop. As close as we were, he looked far away. I turned back to the word and tried to understand. Without his hand to guide me, I traced each letter. "What does it say?" I asked. "Lily," he said. "Like Mama." "Like Mama. Does that mean she'll be in the dictionary?" "In a way, yes. Will we all be in the dictionary?" "No." "Why?" I felt myself rise and fall on the movement of his breath. A name must mean something to be in the dictionary. I looked at the word again. "Was Mama like a flower?" I asked. Da nodded. "The most beautiful flower." He picked up the word and read the sentence beneath it. Then he turned it over, looking for more. "It's incomplete," he said, but he read it again, his eyes flicking back and forth as if he might find what was missing. He put the word down on the smallest pile. Da pushed his chair back from the sorting table. I climbed off his lap and readied myself to hold the first pile of slips. This was another job I could help with, and I loved to see each word find its place among the pigeonholes. He picked up the smallest pile, and I tried to guess where Mama would go. "Not too high and not too low," I sang to myself. But instead of putting the words in my hand, Da took 3 long steps towards the fire grate and threw them into the flames. There were 3 slips. When they left his hand, each was danced by the draught of heat to a different resting place. Before it had even landed, I saw Lily begin to curl. I heard myself scream as I ran towards the grate. I heard Da bellow my name. The slip was writhing. I reached in to rescue it, even as the brown paper charred and the letters written on it turned to shadows. I thought I might hold it like an oak leaf, faded and winter crisp, but when I wrapped my fingers around the word, it shattered. I might have stayed in that moment forever, but Da yanked me away with a force that winded. He ran with me out of the scriptorium and plunged my hand into the snow. His face was ashen, so I told him it didn't hurt. But when I unfurled my hand, the blackened shards of the word were stuck to my melted skin. Some words are more important than others. I learned this growing up in the scriptorium, but it took me a long time to understand why.
Thank you. It's beautiful.
Yes, so
Draws
that...
you in straight away.
Oh, I'm glad.
So why that beginning?
So in that beginning, in writing they call it a sort of an inciting incident.
Okay.
So it's something that gets the story moving.
Okay.
It's the reason pretty much for everything that Esme does throughout the story. So as I said earlier, a lot of children are curious about words, but that curiosity doesn't necessarily drive them to make decisions on a daily basis. I needed something that would make words so important to Esme that she sometimes broke the rules.
And so was it to her, to me, that word became her mum, her mum?
Yes, yes.
So that's what she was wanting to say, was what it meant for her.
Exactly. So all of a sudden, and before that moment, words were just words.
Yes.
Words were whatever her father told her they meant. So she didn't really question the meanings that she was given when she asked what a word meant. But all of a sudden, that word Lily was more than just a flower. It was her mother. And her mother is dead. She's never known her mother. Everything she knows about her mother are the stories, the photographs, the dresses hanging in her father's wardrobe. But she doesn't actually know her mother, who her mother was. And so she has to glean the meaning of this woman from all of these little bits of information that she inherits in a way from the people around her. So from her father, but also from Dita or Edith Thompson, who is her godmother. And I suppose that's an example of how the meaning of words can change depending on who uses them and how they're used. And the value of words really does lie in their use. So Lily, which is the name of her mother, the meaning is given to Lily through the story that her godmother tells her every year on her birthday, which is the story essentially of how her mother and father met and how Esme came to be. Lily is also in that burnt word. Lily is also in the photographs around her house and so on. So there are lots of, I suppose, examples of what Lily means for Esme, and words are no different. So words gain their meaning from the sentences that we use and also the quotations that are found in books. But I suppose that's what this book is all about. The dictionary itself, and this is an original, extremely heavy. This is an original volume of A and B, and so this dictionary was developed by collating words that had been written down. And if a word hadn't been written down, it wouldn't end up in the dictionary.
Yes.
And this is something that throughout the course of the book, Esme becomes fascinated with, and it also becomes problematic because some words are used by people from lower classes or by women, and she finds that they don't have a textual source, and so they won't end up in the dictionary.
No. And as you say, more than once in the book, some words are more important than others, and so that signifies it.
That's right.
Only the written words are important.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Can I just follow on from that theme, and then we'll go back to some more general questions. So it follows on from Lily. So to me, she almost had a physical presence throughout the book. What was her influence in the role of the book? Why was she there so strongly?
So I suppose all of us, no matter our experience, We either have a mother who's present or we have a mother who's absent. And whether that's physically present or physically absent or just sort of emotionally present, emotionally absent, we all have a relationship to a mother figure in one way or another. Sometimes positive, sometimes negative, sometimes neither. In this book, Lily was an absent mother. And because, particularly at that time, this is sort of late 19th century, early 20th century, to not have a mother in your life when you're a girl is a big deal because men were not homemakers. Men usually did not have the care of children. In my book, Esme is an only child, and in fact her father is her caregiver. And so the absence of a mother has a very strong influence on the relationship that she has with her father because he chooses not to send her away to a female relative. He chooses to look after her and care for her. And just like a single parent today, it means that he has to juggle the care of this little girl with his work. And in that way, she ends up going to the scriptorium, which is where he works as a lexicographer. Just like a lot of people have to take their children to work today if there's no one to care for them. And so the relationship that I was able to develop between her and her father was different because her mother was absent. But because her mother was absent and generally it was thought that men needed a woman in the life of their children in general, but particularly their daughters, there are other women that play the role of mother, I suppose, to Esme. So there's Lizzie, who is the maid in the big house that belongs to Dr. James Murray, and there's also her godmother, Dita.
Thank you. That puts it in a context. But to go back to probably the first question that is often asked is why this topic? And I know you'd read The Surgeon of Crowthorne.
Yeah.
But my question is, what were the sparks after reading that? Because it could have led you anywhere. I mean, there's so many areas that it could have led to.
Yeah. So I've got my little my own little suitcase of goodies. So I have the book that I had read, which is The Surgeon of Crowthorne by Simon Winchester, and you can see it's such a pithy little book.
Yes.
It's non-fiction. So this is a story of a relationship that developed between Dr. James Murray, the editor of the dictionary, and one of the more prolific volunteers. And so Dr. James Murray, I often talk about this as the first sort of crowdsourcing project because he sent out a request across the world for people to send in quotations that show examples of how certain words had been used.
Incredible task.
It was, but without all of these volunteers sort of searching their libraries full of books and writing out the quotations, the dictionary would never, ever have been completed. And it was a fascinating story about the relationship between these two men. And in the process of telling this real story, I gleaned how the dictionary was developed. And I loved the story, but at the end, the thing that stuck with me was it was a particularly male endeavour.
Yes.
And I wondered to myself, well, if all of the words had to be written down, does that mean that some words were missing? That these volumes, and there are 12 of them this size, and bigger, volume C is bigger than this. There are 12, just in the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. And it made me wonder, well, there must be words that were never written down because they were said by people in the birthing room or the laundry or the kitchen or the coal mine. And if they weren't written down, we've lost them. Unless they sort of were maintained in the vernacular, but there must have been some that weren't, and I was really curious about that. And that's all it was for a long time, just a curiosity. And I looked, I even looked up women's words. It's very difficult to search these things, but essentially I can find no record of words that might have existed prior to this dictionary being developed. that were not written down. So we just can't know whether some words have been lost forever. Other words have ended up in slang dictionaries and now in this dictionary, so the latest volumes will include slang.
Yes.
But they didn't really back then.
No.
And slang is basically, words that are used, some would say improperly, but others would say no, they're just the way words have been appropriated by different people.
So words and culture,
yeah,
very important to you.
Yes.
You felt that. It seems
yes,
to be.
completely.
Yes.
And I had the enormous pleasure and privilege of using the volumes, the dictionary volumes, as my primary source of research. And the State Library of South Australia has an immaculate set of first edition Oxford English Dictionary. They look like they're bound exactly the same way, but they're in better condition.
Yes.
And it was extraordinary. And they belong in the Simon Library, which is at the top of the turret on top of the Mortlock Library. And it's sort of manned by volunteers a couple of hours a day, every now and then. And they just very kindly brought every single dictionary down to the reading room and let me come and use them whenever I wanted, which was just wonderful. And the dictionary essentially is a history book, so it's different to most dictionaries actually. It's different to the Macquarie and the Collins dictionary that we all know, which simply gives us a word and the current definition of that word. This actually is a history of every word in the English language, when I put every in inverted commas. But up until that time, that was the goal of the Oxford English Dictionary, which was to document every word in the English language, right back to its first use. And essentially the words that are in here, that's what it's done. And so if the first use was the 12th or 13th century, the quotation is in there.
What an amazing pursuit, isn't it?
And because of that, it's a history book.
Yes.
So you can read it and you can get a sense of some of the cultural values of the time, because there are some words in there that are prefaced with, not to be used in polite company or vulgar. And that's a value judgment.
Yes.
That's certainly not an objective necessarily assessment. Sometimes it is, it's according to the class, gender, education of the person writing up that word. They are the ones calling it vulgar. And an example of that is the word pants. So some words, I suppose we could all agree that they're vulgar.
Yes.
Other words, we probably would argue about whether the word pants, as in trousers, is vulgar.
Yes.
But according to this dictionary, it's a vulgar word. And
it reminds me of Esme, and I can't remember now who she said it to. She said, "Your job is to take the words, not to judge them."
Yes.
Yeah.
She says it to a librarian.
Is it no librarian?
Yeah. So
very much putting him in his place.
Yes, yeah. And it took her a long time to get the courage to say such a thing to such a man. Yeah.
And so another question following on from that, this amazing book that you own now, is your Oxford visits. Did they have an impact on you, and what influence may they have had on the development of your characters?
Well, I feel so nostalgic about this now, because the last time I was in Oxford was August last year.
Gosh.
So I did 2 research trips to Oxford, one right at the beginning of writing the book and then one right at the end. And both trips were enormously influential on the writing of the book. So I was given access to the archives at Oxford University Press, and not just to the dictionary archives, but to the archives of the press as well, which was wonderful. And when I talk about the archives, essentially I had access to the original slips that make up the dictionary. and they are stored in archive boxes. You know, there's boxes and boxes and boxes and boxes of them, hundreds of thousands of slips. Now, of course, not everyone gets into the dictionary, but even those that were rejected are still there. And so I get a sense, I was able to get a sense of the types of quotations that might have been used for particular words that I was interested in, and which quotations were accepted and which were rejected. And even that tells you something about the...
because you had access to the whole...
Yeah.
The whole process.
That's right.
Yeah.
I also had access to the proofs. So they would print a proof and then someone would check it, edit it. Sometimes it would go over the page, and just like anything, they sometimes had to make it fit a bit better, and so they might exclude something.
Yes.
And from that I can see that some words had been originally planned to go in the dictionary and then they'd been crossed out at the last minute.
So who made that decision?
Yeah, and sometimes those words were women's words, or words that had been developed by a woman or written by a woman in a novel or something. And so an example of that is the word literately, which which is in the novel, which makes perfect sense to me. So you can say, for instance, it was very literately written.
Yes.
And it just means learnedly, you know. And that word was in a quotation in a novel that was written by a woman, and it was the only quotation at the time that they'd found. And because it only had a single example of use, that was a criteria in a way to get rid of it. However, other words are in the dictionary that also had single use.
In the
written sort of for evidence, and yet they stayed in. And an example of that is literata. So it's on the same page.
Gosh.
And Coleridge coined the phrase literata, which means a literary lady. And you know, so my question was, so are literary ladies so unique as to require their own word? Can they not just be lumped in with literati?
Yes.
You know, literary people, which is defined as literary people, not literary men. So, and yet that word stays in, and he gets something like 5 lines in the dictionary, and our lady author gets none.
We suggest there is some power and influence going on.
Yeah, look, I totally, you know, I completely acknowledge that I have cherry-picked evidence that fits my thesis to some extent, though there are also scholars, dictionary scholars, and I've got another little example in here. This book, which was one of my resources that I used, Linda Mugglestone is a dictionary scholar, and she's written a lot about words that have been left out of dictionaries, not just the Oxford English Dictionary, and so she has found that there has been a bias towards men's words and away from women's.
Really, wouldn't we? Over 100 years ago, would we? Would we
Yes.
have expected?
Yes, I think the answer to that is, of course, we would expect it. The structures around at that time, women couldn't vote.
No.
So, you know, they couldn't vote. A lot of women who were writing novels were writing under male pseudonyms.
Yes.
You know, the structure of society back then was biased towards men's experience.
Yes.
So it would not make sense if it wasn't a gendered book. Yeah.
So really, that leads on this question about how you feel women's words were handled during the time that this first dictionary was compiled, and really you're saying they were undervalued or not heard.
I think so, but I don't think on purpose. So Dr. James Murray, in fact, developed quite a scientific process for the inclusion of words, and he had in his mind that he wanted it to be quite an objective assessment of words. It was fundamentally flawed because the words had to have been written down, and I don't know the exact proportion, but let's say 80% or more of texts were written by men up until that early 20th century.
Yes.
And they were going right back to the 12th century. So if you think...
It had to be that way.
It had to be that way. If you acknowledge that most literature was written by men, but not just literature, they were also looking at journals, scientific journals.
And even pamphlets, we see.
Pamphlets, yeah. Even they found one word on a medicine bottle, on the label of a medicine bottle. All sorts of places. Eventually newspapers as well. So Dr. Murray was very insistent actually that newspapers should be included because they were the most up-to-date examples of how words were used. But the men of the Philological Society and the Oxford University Press delegates, and these are the people who sort of made some of the decisions about how the dictionary was funded and so on, they would have preferred that newspapers weren't included, but particularly working class newspapers, particularly, the Telegraph and so on. It's all right if the London Times was used, but not other newspapers, and for the same reason that they wanted to discourage the use of a lot of words.
But they didn't get their way.
No, they didn't. Dr. Murray insisted, but in the end some words had to be jettisoned, and often those words were the words that had the least amount of evidence, and the words with the least amount of evidence are usually words used by the working classes or the illiterate or women.
Yes. So, speaking of the role of men at that time in the culture, and yet Esme and her father had a beautiful and warm relationship, and there are relationships which Esme later on as a mature woman goes on to develop, one of which you could say is perhaps not entirely of that ilk, but one that does become similar to the one with her dad. And my question is, what are you demonstrating in that?
So a few things actually. It was a deliberate decision to present positive male-female relationships in this book, and I did that for a few reasons. The first actually is because I have grown up with really, really positive, loving, supportive, encouraging relationships with men. The relationship between Esme and her father is not so different to the relationship I had with my dad. And the relationship she has with other men, including Dr. Murray and other lexicographers in the scriptorium, is similar to relationships I've had with men who have mentored me in jobs and things like that, and friends. And I have a good relationship with my partner. So I have two sons.
Yes.
And I think that's an important thing to say.
Yes.
So the truth is that back when this novel is set, there were structural inequalities between men and women, but they were changing. So this is a time of the women's suffrage movement, and the women's suffrage movement wasn't just a movement of women, it was a movement of men and women who wanted equality between men, right to vote, they wanted makers and so on. So it's not accurate really to present all male-female relationships as unequal and wanting to perpetuate that structural inequality. And there's a lot of examples in the literature, and James Murray himself was an advocate of women's suffrage, and two of his daughters worked with him in the scriptorium, three actually, but two worked with him right through for decades. And the same was the case for other editors who had daughters and wives working with them. And a lot of these women were part of the suffrage movement, and so it is actually true to life and true to this particular context, which was, this is Oxford, this is the town of Oxford, these are all Oxford University men, mostly, and a lot of the women actually went to Oxford University, though were not allowed to graduate with a degree from Oxford University until 1920. So even during the lifetime of this book, they could get a degree and they could actually come first, and they will not have the honour conferred.
No.
And so Dr. Murray's daughters went to Oxford and Cambridge, and And so it wasn't actually an unusual occurrence for men to be supportive of their daughters' ambitions and their daughters' right to work and their daughters' right to vote.
I think it's you present a very nuanced view of it, and it beautifully dovetails. It doesn't contradict, as I've read the book, the issues that the suffragettes and the suffragists, which I now understand the difference.
Yeah.
It doesn't contradict that at all. It makes perfect sense that they are entwined.
Yeah, and I think it's important to see, even today, I think it's important to see that these are not black and white issues. That the structures that we all live and work in determine so much of what we can and can't do. And the same was the case in, even more so back in the early 20th century. The structures were very rigid, but they changed because men and women, because most people wanted change. That's why women got the vote, is because eventually it was the most logical, right thing to do. And I hope that those sorts of changes continue to happen, and they happen because we come together as a community, we come together as human beings to see the fairness of giving people a voice.
And I guess that comes out of the relationships, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Now, I have a question about bondmaid. So, it's the first lost word?
Yes.
Am I allowed to say that?
You are.
Being a spoiler?
It's right at the beginning of the book.
My question is about how that meaning changes over time. Also, am I allowed to say that?
Yeah.
Initially, Lizzie saying it's a horrible word. And no, Esme says to Lizzie it's a horrible word. And then Lizzie basically says, well, we just have to accept that that's the way life is, basically. And then towards the very end, it has a completely additional meaning. Do you want to talk about that?
Well, first of all, the interesting thing is, this is one of the sparks, actually, for writing the book.
Okay.
As I was doing that research around women's words, just generally, where they left out, I kept coming across this little anecdote about one word that was lost from this volume, in fact, from A and B. Yeah. And that word was bondmaid. And bondmaid means a slave girl, so someone who's bonded for life. And this word literally went missing in real life. And Dr. Murray didn't find out about it until about 1901, and this was published, it should have been published in 1888, which is when this was published, but he didn't find out it was missing until someone from the public wrote him a letter inquiring about it. And I fictionalised that in my book. That letter actually doesn't exist anymore. There's just a record of it arriving and Dr. Murray's response, which was incredulous and, furious. And he insists it's the only word that has ever been lost accidentally. Now, I doubt this because the process...
So many words.
Yes, and the process of making the dictionary goes something like this. All of these tiny little slips, which come in on postcard-sized bits of paper, they come to the scriptorium, which was a shed in the back garden of James Murray's house, and literally a big, huge garden shed. And that's where he and his lexicographers work. And the walls are just covered in these pigeonholes full of slips, hundreds and thousands of slips with words and quotes on them. Then they sort them into order and quotation, and then they're tied with string and sent to the press, probably in someone's satchel on a bicycle.
Yes.
And they're taken over to the Oxford University Press, which is about 10 minutes away by bicycle. And then they're given to a typesetter. And so I have a character in the book who is a typesetter, Gareth.
Yes.
And literally they are still in the bundles. They untie the bundles and they start setting the pages. And they're all the slips are numbered in case they fall, they can be put back in the right order and so on. But there are so many places and so many ways that a slip could get lost.
Yes.
So I don't believe that it's the only word that ever went missing, but apparently it is. And because of the word, because it means slave girl, and my interest was in women's words, this was just a gift. I just couldn't believe it when I read this story.
Word.
That's right, and I think that's when I decided I have to write a novel. And you're right, the word itself is like a character in the book. For me anyway, there are many more characters than human characters. So one of the characters is bondmaid, and there's another word in there that has a character arc as well to some extent. And so a few words come in and out of the story with their own sort of personalities, I suppose. But just like any character in a story, the word bondmaid kind of changes somewhat throughout the book. And it changes based on its interaction with the people who use it. And that was one of the things I suppose I was exploring in the book, is how do words change and how do words get their meanings? And words get their meanings by being used, and they are constantly changing. It is our language is a work in progress always. And English, I think French and even Italian perhaps, but French in particular, there's this effort to try and pin the language down, and that the definitions don't change, or they don't. No one wants them to change. Whereas English isn't like that. English has always accepted that words change over time as they're used, and I suppose my book is sort of showing that can happen.
So when you started with that, did you know it would end up being a different word?
No, I didn't.
A different definition?
No.
Fascinating. So it evolved for
you
in the writing?
Yeah, so in terms of how I write, I did sort of plot it out to some extent, because in fact, the way I thought about the story wasn't linear. I would jump into different things. Something would interest me, and I would jump into a scene. So in fact, I wrote the beginning and the end first. So I knew exactly how it would end, and in fact, in terms of the very, very end, I wrote that. That was one of the very first things I wrote, and I barely changed a word. So I knew that would happen. And then I sort of had a general idea of what was going to happen at different times, but I wrote it kind of like more of a patchwork quilt, if you like. So I'd write a scene that belonged here in the story, then I'd write a scene that belonged here, then one that belonged here, and all the time, I guess my idea of the entire story was being developed over time. And I had a sense of where it was all going, but within a scene or within a chapter or within a part, it would evolve as I wrote. So
then you put the pieces together.
Yeah, and sometimes they don't fit, and so you get rid of a piece, because in fact I started writing something which changed my whole idea of what might happen with a particular character or whatever. But that's the beauty, that's what I actually love so much about writing, is that you don't always know what's going to happen, and it happens as it's coming out of your pen or out of your fingers. And it's almost like it's bypassing consciousness. It's just going straight onto the page, and it's as much a revelation to me as it is to the reader as they're reading it. And I'm getting as excited, I hope, as a reader might, as they're reading it, because all of a sudden I realise what's happening, or I realise what's going to happen. So, there are times, this might sound really stupid, but there are times I made myself cry. And I know I've made a few readers cry.
Yes, absolutely.
And if it's any consolation, I cried too, because I didn't know something was going to happen until it started to happen. And there's an inevitability about some aspects of a story.
It seems to me that you're describing something that inhabits you.
It does, and it's not fully conscious. And I think it's the sort of perhaps when you're working on a book, it's so deep-seated that it is something that works away on itself while you're asleep or while you're doing other things. You know that feeling sometimes when you can't remember something and so you move on and then you
Yes.
remember it.
Yes.
I've heard a neurologist talk about that, and they said what's happening is your brain, you've essentially delegated that to a lower part of your brain, and your brain has been working on it diligently while you've been doing other things. And then it kind of goes, right, ding, okay, that job's done, here it is.
Yes.
I'll hand up that memory
Box.
you were looking for, or that
Yeah.
word you couldn't quite articulate before. And I think when you're writing a book, the same thing happens. You've got like a problem of story, or you've just got a character in something, you've written down something that they're doing, but you haven't thought too much ahead, but deep down you are thinking. And when you go to write next time, it just comes out.
Yes.
And it's so
Through the
exciting.
fingers.
It's so exciting, and
Wonderful.
because usually if it comes out that way, it's because it's a perfect fit, I find.
Yes.
And
It seems-
that's why it's exciting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Mm.
Okay. Just to ask one or two questions, and because I've got others, but I don't want to make any spoilers, and I think some of them might. So, why do you think it is that your work has so connected with people at the moment?
Yeah, it's just been a wonderful surprise. Although I hesitate to say surprise, I have to admit, when I thought of this idea and when I thought to write it, I did Google, has anyone written a book like this?
Yes.
And I was amazed that no one had. That no one had written fiction. So we've got Simon Winchester has written his Surgeon of Crowthorne,
Yes,
and he also
yes.
wrote a follow-up book to this called The Meaning of Everything. And it was a really short history of how the dictionary was made. Since then, this book has come out, and you can see this is my Bible.
Yes.
Peter Gilliver is a lexicographer at the Oxford English Dictionary today, and he wrote the history of the dictionary. So that's the one I really referred to when I needed the facts. But I think the reason, so when I say I'm not completely surprised that it resonates, I think that's because I immediately understood that it was a good idea in a way, that there was this big missing piece around the history of the dictionary, and we all use it in the English-speaking language. Even if we don't use the Oxford Dictionary,
Yes.
the dictionaries we do use have been based on the Oxford Dictionary, if you know what I mean. This is the gold standard. And I found it incredible that no one had interrogated its gender bias before, in a way. But then again, I didn't think I was really up to writing a novel about it. But I did it because I really, really wanted to, and then I just got wrapped up in it. And so I'm a bit surprised at how well it's done and how well it resonates with people. But I think it resonates because it's about who gets to have a say. It's about representation. And that question hasn't gone away. So
No.
mine's historical fiction, and I'm asking about, the questions that were in my head as I was writing it are all about, were women represented in this dictionary, on a simple level? And to some extent, were lower classes represented in this dictionary? But the same question you could apply today. How well does language, our language, the English language, how well does it represent all sorts of people in our communities?
Yes.
So immediately the groups of people I'm thinking of are First Nations people. So First Nations people who have been in this country a lot longer than we have, and yet we don't use their language. We ask them to use our language, English. But how well does English represent their connection to country or to kin, or to what's happening in the world today? Probably not very well, and yet we insist that they use our language to explain all of those things to us, so that we can acknowledge them and so that we can treat them with respect. And so Indigenous people in Australia and around the world are not represented in our texts and our, the books that tell us what things mean. And then the other thing that I think is really relevant today is things around climate change and, at the moment, Black Lives Matter. the words that we use are really important, and say with climate change and Black Lives Matter, some people use words to put other people down.
Yes.
And there's an example in the novel, and that example is the word suffragette.
Yes.
So suffragette is a word that was coined in 1906 by newspaper men, actually, who were anti-suffrage.
Okay.
And they used it to put down the women who'd started to become militant in their suffrage activities.
Process, yes.
Yeah. So up until around then, the suffragists
Yes.
tended to they marched, they agitated with words, they lobbied government and so on, but they weren't disturbing the peace,
No.
other than marching. Suffragettes, who were really from Emmeline Pankhurst's
Yes.
WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, they started to become militant in their activities. So graffiti, eventually letter bombs, and even, they were willing to harm people and property.
Mm.
And the newspapers started calling them suffragettes. The jet at the end is a diminutive.
Yes.
So it means something that's smaller than, less important than the original.
Mm.
If you think of cigarette, in
Yes.
fact, it's a smaller version of a cigar.
Yes.
Kitchenette,
Yes.
all those things,
Yes.
they're to indicate that something's not as good as.
Yes.
And so it was a put down for these women. And then the way they're described in the newspaper clippings that were stuck onto the slips that I saw when I was in Oxford, they call them, the screeching, husbandless, the terminology that they used around suffragettes was fascinating,
Yes.
really put down, but basically
Powerful,
saying,
negative,
very,
vulgar,
yes, and really talking about women stepping out of line and misbehaving
yes.
and acting up.
Very
And
troublesome.
troublesome. And I was struck by how similar this language was to the way some sort of shock jocks were talking about Greta Thunberg, for instance, and other young women who were fighting for climate change action. They were talking about them as little girls with mental illness, acting up, essentially. And they were saying that, their parents should be held to account for letting them run riot, essentially, and that was sometimes what was said about suffragettes, that the men in their lives should have had better control
the
of them.
fathers and the
Yeah,
etc.
and so I think, all of a sudden words are being used and coined to put women back in their place, or to put anybody who disagrees with a political point of view in their place. And I suspect the same is happening with Black Lives Matter, and Donald Trump does it all the time.
Yes.
In terms of using language to put people in their place. So I think that might be why it resonates.
Well, there's certainly in your work, in your book, a lot of evidence for the power of language,
Yeah.
the power of words. It's beautifully stated, I think, in a particular letter.
From
by
a
Gareth,
soldier,
the soldier, and who talks about the relief of being able to write without filter.
Yeah.
It crossed my mind that would be something that Indigenous peoples probably don't feel. Being able to write or speak without filter, just from the heart.
Yes, I think you're right, and the Black Lives Matter protests at the moment is part of that. People can't be who they are without risking some sort of censorship, and when that censorship comes at the end of a baton or a gun, you're in trouble. But
Exactly.
my book doesn't delve into that. The
No, it
censorship
doesn't.
that is being talked about in that letter is during World War I. Letters home from the front were
Yes,
censored,
yes.
literally.
And in World War II.
And in World War II. And in some ways there were two levels of censorship. So individuals would censor themselves
Yes.
because they didn't want their loved ones to
be
worry.
concerned, yes.
But then the government had all the letters censored as well because they didn't want morale to drop
Yes.
back home. And so you weren't allowed to, it wasn't just that they didn't want secrets
No.
revealed, they didn't want people to realise how awful it was.
Yes.
in the trenches. And so, superior officers were tasked with crossing out, anything that might concern the general public back home. So in that letter, there's this sense of just unburdening,
Yes.
and how words allow us to express ourselves completely.
Yes.
But also sometimes, and this is something I explore, very often words are completely inadequate. There is sometimes never a word that will meet an experience, that will stand up to the experience. And in those times, in my book anyway, people are silent. There are times when no words are used because in fact there are none.
And then often there are beautiful descriptions.
Yeah.
Just to round up, I had a friend make a comment after reading your book, and she said, "Now I'm going to feel emotional." She didn't say that. She said, "I feel bereft, as it was such a lovely story with endearing characters whom I would have loved to have known,
Oh.
both fictional and non-fictional. It would have been a treasure if such a book had been published," she meant the Dictionary of Lost Words. So glad that Pip found all the words to make that happen, to write the story.
Yes, that's beautiful, and
I thought so.
I'm so grateful to that. And it's interesting. Like I said, I don't know what words have been lost. Every word in this book is real, so I haven't made up any words. But if I think that would be a treasure, to find a book of words that never ended up in the dictionary, and so hasn't been able to, they haven't been able to find their way in the world into the future. But that was one of the difficulties of writing a book about lost words, when you don't know what the lost words are.
Where they are.
Even obviously,
today.
that's right. There's obviously some I have been able to find, but I know that there would be hundreds of words, thousands of words that we have lost completely.
But you found some.
I found some. But I couldn't find them. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.